Referring to Skyrim, Taverner says the game can be a beautiful representational artifact. As opposed to naturalist, the art of games like Missile Command is much more alien. But how does it do this? Here we may use the Munsell system as explained by Simon Neanderthal, a system that breaks color into hue, chroma, and amount of neutral gray. Missile Command uses only base colors. Its value is extremely bright and the chroma of its bombs is very saturated. As I will explain, the Pixelanian tends to work with extremes, which creates a unique effect that attracts the eye as if it was a moth. In Missile Command, the use of color is unorthodox and theoretically unappealing. The colors are not the type you'd use to, say, dress yourself in, nor to decorate your house with, but the art no less remains aesthetically interesting in the same sense that Francis Bacon's artwork is aesthetically interesting. This is where I disagree with the term beautiful, as Gaud explains it. Graceful or elegant properties which ground a capacity to give sensuous pleasure. For it does not take into consideration the aesthetically interesting. Many works can be bleak but alluring, highly atmospheric. To narrow down the possible aesthetics of art to be beautiful, whatever that entails, means to exclude a lot of great artworks. Think of Francisco Goya's Saturn devouring one of his sons, or even Frida Kahlo's Wounded Deer. What would they be is forced to comply to our beauty standards. Further into painting parallels, Expressionism can be linked to the style of the Pixelanian. There's something about the use of visible bits of pixels that attracts the eye in a way that parallels the visible thick strokes of a Van Gogh, which creates movement. Of course, the Pixelanian also seems like it is moving, but this is because it actually is moving. The comparison with painting can only go so far, as video games use completely different color constraints to those of painting. Rather than chemical mixtures to create different pigments, in video games, colors exist as numerical values. The Pixelanian's three base colors are red, green and blue, as opposed to red, yellow and green, as in painting. Also, the process of the retro is purely digital computational, a process affected by the natural color capabilities of primitive screens. The nuances of color in computer graphics are dependent upon the internal memory allocated to determine the color of each pixel. Color depth describing the number of bits. Most Pixelanian games tend to have lower color depth, meaning less available colors. However, there could be a positive to these limitations, that of high contrast, the Pixelanian's main aesthetic tool. As Neanderthal argues, games like Asteroids and Lunar Lander, with their use of monochromatic colors, in this case white and black, could make the predominance of black express the loneliness of space. But when it comes to sprite-based games, he explains that there are limitations to this symbolic cargo. I can't completely agree with this, because even if the predominance of black isn't supposed to be a conscious choice by the designer, it can still affect the mood of these sprite-based games. I do not know which sprite games Neanderthal is referring to here, but I don't believe this is the case with games like Asteroids or Lunar Lander. Black, regardless if the color was a conscious choice or not, is very valuable. Practically, there is a benefit in the high contrast of black against other colors, especially white, which creates a practical visual affordance for the player. However, some monochromatic games maximize the amount of black in the screen by using only outlines of white, vectors, to signal the game's artifacts, avatars, asteroids, moons, etc. It's such an emptiness that the mountains and asteroids seem hollow. Here especially, the game creates a depressive and empty atmosphere. Black here plays a bigger role than simply being the contrasting background. Regarding his point, however, I do agree that the player can learn different color associations, but I do believe that there are colors of which associations come prepackaged with the type of game. For instance, the use of black with white vectors is no doubt a popular choice for games about space. For this, please refer to half the catalog of Atari. Some games already included here. Furthermore, this contrast and color association is not exclusive to monochromatic games. Missile Command and Saber Wolf use similar brightness and basic colors. for these are both 8-bit games. However, this is where their color similarities end. Firstly, there's the predominant use of green in Saberwolf to represent nature, against the predominant use of red in Missile Command to represent an upcoming doom. The sole usage of RBG, aside from the odd usage of orange or browns to separate the ground from the action, is not only what makes Missile Command's color spectrum more basic, but also more contrasting. Again, there's a sense of uneasiness in all this clashing. The dominance of the red guides the eye to the missiles on screen. However, this use of color also serves to highlight the atomic threat. The danger that is often associated with red, referred to stop signs, reflects the radioactiveness of the bombs. The visuals are not purely supposed to be an idyllic representation of the real-life object. The reality of color is much more abstract here. The fact that the ground is often also red reflects on the inevitability of your mission. Eventually, the city will fall. Here, the world works in a way that's different to ours, for the city already appears to be affected by the bomb. Rather than simply depicting a city, Missile Command is creating a mood. The game does not worry about the verisimilitude of the image. On the whole, Missile Command creates not a dual appearance, but a radioactive aesthetic, somewhat like a hallucinogenic trip. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that the typical use of the pixelanian style recreates the feel of a bad trip, something that most of the early industry designers were no doubt very familiar with, something that nonetheless reflects on the culture of the cyber-chemical 80s. While I believe Saberwolf to be prettier in the more general definition of the word, Missile Command is the pixelanian game that uses its tools most effectively, as to alienate the player from their natural world. Again, the aim of the pixelanian, as opposed to that of realism, is to create a sense of foreign space, a space that you experience in a different way. The problem of Saberwolf lies at the core of its themes, nature. The style, mandatory at the time because of the lack of resources, simply fits better with themes of technology, such as the dangers of our increased knowledge, atomic bombs. This is where I will begin referring to the pixelanian as a possible form of Olipo, or more specifically, Ogapo. For to use the pixelanian style for a contemporary game is to put oneself in the position of an early industry designer. The aim is to create something of value with specific constraints. Further to this, I will encourage the neo-pixelanian designer to use these constraints in the context of technology, for, as stated, this is the aesthetic goal of the pixelanian. Going back to the clusters of art, the pixelanian has been so far shown to fit within number 1 and number 2. Beautiful in its own way, and it conveys an emotion, dread in the case of Missile Command. However, this also proves the originality of the pixelanian, because the aesthetic it creates is nothing like what came before the cybernetic age, and it is unique within a market dominated by verisimilitude and realism. Furthermore, it requires skill to work with color constraints and to be able to find suitable themes and materials for the project. Thus, I would also argue that the pixelanian has been shown to fit within number 7 and number 8 from the cluster.